We're going to look today at finding knowledge graph IDs, a fun occupation that I actually enjoy a great deal, and it's the kind of rabbit hole that once I start going down it, I often spend entire afternoons digging and digging and digging. So what I've done, as you can see, is prepare multiple examples so that I don't go down a rabbit hole, because nobody wants to watch that happening. So we start with Kalicube's Knowledge Graph Explorer. What this does is it asks Google's Knowledge Graph API what it can find for a specific term. So as you can see, I've searched around myself and my companies, lots of experiments going on there. And if you search, it will come up with the type, the ID, which is what we're looking for today, and other information from the Knowledge Graph API. And if you click on the link, it will show you the SERP that corresponds to that entity. And here you can see we're only doing search kgmid equals /g, blah, 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 the rest. That's because it just basically makes sure that it's showing you what it knows about that KGID rather than the query. Now I've got some other examples. Daddy Koala, another experiment that I've been doing. Daddy Koala is a fictional character. Now, quick explanation here. The previous one was /g, this is /m. /g is more recent. /m comes from the Freebase database that Google bought years ago and then closed, and it ported all of that information into Wikidata. So anything /m is probably before 2015. Anything /g has been created since 2015. So for Daddy Koala, we click on that link and we can see Daddy Koala is a fictional character, and we've got this description straight from my own site, which indicates that I'm the authority on Daddy Koala. Google trusts me to provide that explanation, and we have the knowledge graph ID here, /m0122, whatever it would be. Then we can go on, if we wish to, onto, for example, Grandpa Koala. Once again, I've got the description. I've been working on these as part of my experiments. Now, to find the knowledge graph ID here, I mean, I could look in the knowledge graph API, but I can also look like this, page source, and then just look in the page for /g. Now, /g/, now it hasn't found the /g/. That means it's a /m/, which means it was in the Freebase database years and years ago. There you go. Now, just to be absolutely sure we've got the right one, I don't just take the data entity ID, because that in fact is one of these. So you want to avoid that and go on to, that's another related people also search for, and here's the one we want, and you can check it by saying that it's got the name next to it. So we've got this little sequence here, null, comma, x22, and then this ID, which goes to the next x22. So this here, from that /m all the way through to that pt6, is my knowledge graph ID. I'll make that bigger so you can see it. There you go. And you can double check that it's the correct one, because it's got the name of the entity written in the next field along after the next x22, Daddy Koala. So that's techniques 1 and 2. If I then close that window and we can go back to Grandpa Koala, I'll show you the next technique, which I often use. If we look up barking dogs, which is a music group I was in, and we scroll through, and there are lots of them. It's terribly, terribly ambiguous. And if we go back to the barking dogs, one of these is the one I'm talking about, the barking dogs. Right, musical group, lots and lots of them. It's very ambiguous because we've had multiple barking dogs groups knocking around over the last few years. And that's my one. Once again, I have that knowledge panel description because I've been working on it, and you can see that it's the correct group. That's me up there. I submitted that photo through my own website, convinced Google that was the right photo to be using. And then we come to the next interesting part, because we can now click on these results, which we didn't necessarily find here in the Knowledge Graph Explorer. There you go. And find the Knowledge Graph ID in this particular page. Now, what I would then do is once again go in here, search for /m/, and there you've got once again those related data entity ID means that people also search for. And if I look here, I found the barking dogs, which is the group. And if I go back here, oh, it's found all of these, and I'm looking for Spasm, in fact, so I could probably usefully keep going. There you go, I was going to get that wrong. You see, this is the knowledge graph ID, once again between the x22 bloody blah x22, once again it's /m, it was in Freebase, and I double check with the name here, Spasm, and it's in the category music, which is delightful to know. So those are two interesting ways to look at it. And if I want to then, go back here, and I'm going to copy this across, and then just a quick interesting extra tool in Kalicube is the reverse lookup. We can actually reverse look up these knowledge graph IDs. There you go, and it finds it. Spasm, album by the Barking Dogs, very clear. And if I click there, we come back to this page. So you can also reverse look up these knowledge graph IDs to double check. Now, really importantly, the knowledge graph API only returns entities that are in the main knowledge graph, but there are multiple vertical knowledge graphs that do not necessarily have a place in the main one. For example, books, podcasts, and so on and so forth. So bear with me, we're going to look at those in a moment because we can still find those, and it's surprising how many we can find and how incredibly simple it is. Now, coming on to Bua and Koala, I was just prepared this as an example because we can click on the songs, the cleaning up song. As you can see here, we have the cleaning up song, which is there, and I wanted to show you this interesting little trick, which is the Google stick parameter decoder that I've been using to show. Here we have the subject of this query and the object of the query. The cleaning up song, let's go and have a look at what the ID is. So we go back here, that's Bua and Koala, which is the MID we just saw here, that one. Going back here, we can then find the G. There you go, which is the cleaning up song. This was created after Freebase, thanks to the work I've been doing with WordLift, and it's the CX15 there at the end, which corresponds to the object. So the subject is Bua and Koala, and the object is the song, the cleaning up song, which is an interesting new way that I found recently to look at it. And the person who built this tool, whose name I'm afraid I cannot remember, is an absolute genius. So what I've been calling knowledge graph hopping is that you just click on the links and you just keep going from different knowledge panels to knowledge panel. 12 sing-along songs, that's another knowledge panel with the share button here. That's how you tell that it's a knowledge panel. And we can skip around happily from entity to entity, and this is what I meant about the rabbit hole. It's the rabbit hole I immediately go down as soon as I start looking at this stuff. So let's stop that right now. So back here, authors, brilliant. This is my sister. She's part of the Google Books vertical, and we can see the share button here, which indicates that it is a knowledge panel, and we can find her knowledge graph ID the same way. Right click, view page source, search for, double check on the name, and Bob's your uncle. And we can also look for, let's have a look at the multimodal writer. Here we have another one, and we can do the same thing. Keep checking, keep collecting these knowledge graph IDs. Once again, really importantly, if I take the knowledge graph ID for this one, which is going to be a G because it's relatively recent, skip through all the related ones and come to the one we know is right. There we go, the multimodal writer, blah, 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 blah. And if we look at that in the reverse lookup, we will see that it returns nothing, and that's because it's part of the Google Books vertical, and the Google Knowledge Graph cannot access that directly. Now, something more practical, which is businesses, a guy called Dan Sharp. Who knows who he is? He's a musical artist. Lots of things going on in America, but I was actually looking for the Dan Sharp from Screaming Frog for no reason other than I use it from time to time. we have Screaming Frog, we have a knowledge panel, and here we have Dan Sharp, and I can just click on that and find Dan Sharp. Now, he hasn't claimed his knowledge panel. When you see that claim this knowledge panel, you can really quickly figure out what the knowledge graph ID is by right-clicking, doing inspect, and you'll find it here under the claim, MID equals /G/ blah, 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 blah. Once again, just another way to do the same thing, find a knowledge graph ID. And if I then click on that, we go back here and we will see clearly that it once again isn't in the main knowledge graph. Oh, it is in the main knowledge graph. I was wrong about that, but it seems pretty confused. So brilliant, wonderful, well done, Dan Sharp and Screaming Frog. A lot of the time when you find one entity in the main knowledge graph, you will find its related entities. Either they're in there already or they will appear fairly quickly once you start working on it. So next, you've all seen these carousels. I've pulled up the SEO podcasts on Spotify. We can use the stick parameter analyzer once again, and you can pull up all of these delightful KGIDs. It doesn't actually tell you what they are, which order it is, so not necessarily as helpful as doing it this way, which is more boring. And there we go. And here we do want the data entity IDs. We've got the Authority Hacker podcast with the KGID next to it. And then if we go further down, we've got the Recipe for SEO Success show with its knowledge graph ID here. The delightful Kate Toon. So another way of pulling them out from wherever they might be in the page, whether it's in these carousels further down here, sometimes you get an entity box. And the stick parameter decoder is really useful for just pulling them out, but the disadvantage is you don't know which is which. And in the case of podcasts, I would bet my bottom dollar that the reverse lookup doesn't function, because there you go, that would be in the podcast vertical. And part of the work we're trying to do at Kalicube is port these or move these knowledge graph IDs from these different verticals, Google Books, Google Podcasts, into the main knowledge graph. And we've successfully done that with several hosts and podcasts, in fact. Now, on to Google My Business. Kalicube has Google My Business, but it doesn't have a knowledge panel at this time, something I'm working on. Once again, we can go here, and it's going to, with Google My Business, it's going to be a /G. And we have the data entity. That's not the correct one. So we keep going, and that's another bizarre number. Sometimes you're going to get those numbers, those strings in different things within the code. Don't worry about that. But here we got the name check of Kalicube, which I will make bigger so you can see it. The Kalicube name check here, X22, and that's the knowledge graph ID for Kalicube in the Google My Business vertical once again. And I'm going to insist very heavily on this. You go back there, you search for it. It doesn't appear because it's not in the main knowledge graph. It's in the Google My Business, Google Maps vertical. And one thing we would expect to try to do with Kalicube is move that entity, Kalicube, into the main knowledge graph, keeping that ID that has been attributed prior using the Google My Business vertical. Next up, and this is the fun one that I've been playing with recently, is within Kalicube, in the brand SERP, we actually analyze the entities that Google can find within the brand SERP. And as you can see here, for the Jason Barnard brand SERP, we found myself, we found Kalicube. You can click on that link and you can see that it's found Kalicube, and there you get that knowledge graph ID once again. Once again, we're not searching for anything except the KGM ID to make sure that Google is showing us exactly what corresponds to that KGM ID, and it's able to fill in the name of Kalicube just from that ID. So that association is very solid in Google's little brain. We've got Rand Fishkin. There you go. The fact that he's in the Google Books vertical doesn't mean that he isn't also in the main Google Knowledge Graph vertical. If I look here, I'm very sure that he is in there. There you go. And we've got that same result once again. So having that Google Books description does not necessarily mean that the entity is not in the main knowledge graph. And if we clicked on Geraldine de Ruyter's name, we would once again go knowledge panel hopping. We could also go and have a look at Larry Kim if we were interested, or Gary what's his face, and so on and so forth, and you get lost very quickly searching around. But what was really interesting I found here is the different ones that I managed to find. Search engine journal is an interesting one. It says it's an event, but we've got the knowledge graph ID here. That comes /m/, that was in the Freebase database. So, you know, it's been around a long time and so far hasn't ported into the main knowledge graph. We've got Andrew Ervilpini from WordLift there, Joost de Valk, Cindy Crum, PubCon Las Vegas. Oh, there you go. That's a delightful knowledge panel for the event. That was, in fact, last year. So here we can see the knowledge graph ID is /G11, what's its face, something, and 8B at the end. So that's a really nice way from your own brand SERP, not only to figure out knowledge graph IDs, but also to see what entities appear in your brand SERP and which ones Google can understand from your brand SERP. And from this particular case, from the Jason Barnard one, by the way, the blue highlighted ones are explicitly recognized by Google as entities with those links. The other ones don't link. This one, for example, that is an entity in the knowledge graph, but Google hasn't recognized it from the context of the brand SERP, which is slightly unfortunate. There you go, that it's in the knowledge graph and it's all hunky-dory. So the fact that it doesn't recognize it doesn't mean to say it doesn't know it. It just means that from the text that we analyze, which is just the simple text from the brand SERP, within that context, it couldn't figure out which entity it was talking about. It has made its best guess, which it thinks it's an organization, which isn't true. Next up, we go to here, which is within the Kalicube Pro tool again. You can write the description for an entity. In this case, it's with Jason Barnard, the podcast, which I didn't manage to find any other way until we used the Google's NLP to analyze this text. And I rewrote the text until it figured out with Jason Barnard, it thinks it's a person, but when you click on it, we actually have a specific KGID here, which is for the podcast itself. And we can see clearly that it's understood that it is the podcast and not the person. So once again, this text here, it says person. It's guessing at what kind of entity it is from the context. So what's actually written inside the knowledge graph, or in this case in the podcast vertical knowledge graph, isn't necessarily what it's putting here within the NLP analysis. The NLP analysis is guessing at what kind of entity it might be. But we go through again, we can see Kalicube, we've got Eric Engi, Barry Schwartz, Eleda Solis, Fran Fishkin, Bill Splowski, so on and so forth. Digital Olympus, that's a nice one, which is actually a company who have their own knowledge graph ID. Obviously no knowledge panel here, but we can see from the knowledge graph ID, it's managed to identify which entity we are actually talking about. So onwards and upwards, I managed to find the podcast knowledge graph ID using just this text, which I really carefully wrote until Google understood what it was. And the last example I was going to show is I've introduced this tool, which is a Sandbox for writing copywriting, so that you can test your descriptions, figure out what entities Google's seeing without having to put it in the description. So it's a separate tool in the Insights Copywriting Sandbox menu. And here, as you can see, I've just listed the guests, because what I figured out was that if I can create the context here and I just list the people out here, sorry, context above and below in this actual case, I can just list the guests here. And here, as you can see, we've got with Jason Barnard once again. I wouldn't put the entire list of 180 people in my description for the podcast, but to just get their knowledge graph IDs, we've got Razvan Gavrilas here. Dwayne Forrest would have been easy to find anyway, but some people much less obvious. Gianluca Fiorelli, there you go. Once again, it's identified him from this ID that it has. So he's in there, he's just hasn't got his knowledge panel yet. James Brockbank, friend of mine, link builder, agency runner person, delightful chap. Jez Schultz, same thing. All of these people have a presence in the knowledge graph with an ID, and we can find it just by writing clear, contextually unambiguous text, and then listing people or things or companies, I would imagine, into that. As I go through here, you know, loads and loads and loads of people. Alina Ghost. Once again, no knowledge panel, no explicit recognition, except for the fact that it's linked the KGMID, knowledge graph ID, to the name of the person. There you go. So using those techniques, you can find the knowledge graph IDs that you need in order to fill in, and the whole point was to fill in this field here, which is the knowledge graph ID, which helps Kalicube to help you to port, if you're in a different vertical, into the main knowledge graph, or build up the confidence once you are in that main knowledge graph. So get that knowledge graph ID, really, really important. There are problems with duplicate knowledge graph IDs where Kalicube will help you to merge them, but that's the subject for another video. Thank you very much.